I'm Evelyn.
And I'm Robert.
And we're talking about it.
So this is our second anniversary of doing this podcast.
Which also means it's our second anniversary of going in the pandemic.
That's true enough, isn't it?
We started it right as... Yes, we decided for our second anniversary we would do something kind of fun and talk about one of Dad's favorite characters, Tom Bombadil.
Yeah, and so I want to start with something that Tolkien wrote to one of his proofreaders who had sent him a whole bunch of questions.
Okay.
So this is Tolkien's words. Tom Bombadil is not an important person to the narrative. I suppose he has some importance as a comment. I mean, I do not really write that like that. He is just an invention who first appeared in Oxford magazine, and he represents something that I feel important, though I would not be prepared to analyze the feeling precisely. And then he goes on, and he ends with saying, ultimately, only the victory of the West will allow Bombadil to continue or even to survive. Nothing would be left for him in the world of Sauron.
Okay.
Right? So he actually wrote these poems, and they first appeared in the Oxford magazine on 15th February before.
Right.
So this predates putting The Hobbit in writing.
Yeah.
And I find it interesting that this was just something he played with at first and then added it in because he sees the need for a neutral.
Mm-hmm. And just to kind of give a brief summary of Tom Bombadil for those who might need a refresher, because it's been a little bit since we've talked about him. Tom Bombadil was originally the name of a small doll that his sons had that he started writing little poems and short stories about.
And what did the doll wear?
Exactly what they describe in the book.
The blue hat.
The blue hat with the feather.
And the blue hat with the feather, the blue jacket, and yellow boots.
Yep. And it just was inspiration for Tolkien, and he absolutely loved this thing. He ended up loving Tom Bombadil so much that the sequel to The Hobbit, he actually had kicked around the idea for Tom Bombadil to be, or the focus to be around Tom Bombadil, but the editors said no, but he included it in Lord of the Rings anyway because he loved him so much.
Yep. And what's really interesting about Tom Bombadil, like I said, we don't know a whole lot about him. But one of the things is, he can go from battling evil to suddenly singing a silly song.
Right. Or battling evil by singing a silly song.
True that too. And
just because you mentioned that, I was going to bring this up earlier, but I'll bring this up now. There's a whole theory of the Aenir, where
I had that in my notes too. Yeah.
Yeah, because you'll see in both of these poems we're about to read where he gets himself into a little bit of trouble, but he just kind of sings his little songs and everyone obeys him and he's suddenly out of trouble. And just like his wife Goldberry says in Lord of the Rings, it's like he is master. He doesn't own anything, but he is master of it. And I really love that theory that it's with that the music that it operates, that any spirit can be kind of like understood in their soul. If looked incorrectly. And it's just something that I thought was like a really neat interpretation when I was doing my reading about it.
So, few things that we do know before we get on with this is that Tom was there even before the Valar.
Right.
He witnessed the emergence of the forest. He witnessed part of that forest being knocked down for one thing or another. We'll get into it later, but he's been around for, like I said, he's been around for a very long time.
Like, to the point, even the elves' name for him pretty much translates to the oldest and...
The elder.
The elder.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you're old to an elf, you're old.
Right. And every culture within that realm has a tale or a myth or something about Tom Bombadil,
Right.
even if they don't necessarily call him Tom Bombadil. Matter of fact, where he got the name Tom Bombadil was from the hobbits of the Bucklands.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I guess he just really liked it that much because that's what he ends up calling himself, right?
that's right.
So that's
Because it sounds so fun.
it does sound fun.
Tom Bombadil.
But that also just brings to me immediately in my mind thinking about how we now have these two very powerful people, Tom Bombadil and Gandalf, who they are so important and yet they love the hobbits. And the hobbits yet again are underlooked, underutilized, underlooked, overlooked is what I mean. But
Underhill is the name of the place.
True. But most people, again, just like we read in Lord of the Rings right now, where people have only heard of the halflings or stories about them and not really know much about them, we have Tom Bombadil and Gandalf who are friends with the hobbits, who enjoy the hobbits and their ways and their simple way of living. And I can't help but to think that's a little bit of bias from Tolkien because Tolkien himself is a hobbit, essentially.
Yeah, he calls himself a hobbit. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it really shows where Tolkien's priorities kind of lie, where that whole loving, that simplicity of being with nature and the coziness around that.
Right. Now, what's also interesting, I had a hard time finding this information, and all I could keep finding was references to the information. But supposedly, these 2 poems were put in writing by Sam Gamgee.
Okay.
And also entered into the Red Book of March.
Gotcha.
Because
Okay.
that is handed on to him from Frodo.
Right. Okay. That's neat.
Yeah, I could not, like I said, I couldn't find the primary source. I kept finding people talk about it, but I couldn't find a primary source.
Okay. Because we do know that it was written as if it was in Buckland tradition.
Right.
But that would make sense that Sam Gamgee would write and add to it.
Right. And there's a lot of scholars have thought about and try to pin Tom Bombadil down. But it doesn't seem like any of the bigger researchers, most well known, the ones had real time to do the research and everything, they don't tend to agree. I mean, they agree on some things, but not on the bigger things, the large things. So
anything in particular that they don't agree on, or just or like what he represents in
what
general?
he represents, yes.
Okay.
Does he represent the forest? Does he represent the world as a whole? But for me, I'm not saying I'm a scholar, but for me, part of his identity goes to being the husband of Goldberry as well. Goldberry is the daughter of the river. She was originally one of the Elador. She captures him to start with, but then his voice overpowers her.
Right, and we'll get to that
We'll
in
get
a minute.
we'll get to that. We'll get to that. And I think that's really all that I have right now before we start talking about that.
Okay. So I guess we can go ahead and just kind of start with it.
So we'll go ahead and continue here on the poems and then pick up
Yeah.
after the 2 poems, add any other information we need. So here we are with the first poem.
So the first poem that we're going to be talking about is The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, the poem. The book that it's in is called The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, and it's taken from the title of the first poem, which is The Adventures of Tom Bombadil.
Right. The book itself is a collection of his short stories,
which will be Patreon exclusives later on. That we'll end up talking about it. But the first 2 stories, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil and Tom Bombadil Goes Boating, is what we're going to be talking about in our free bonus episode today.
Yep. So one of the things I find interesting here is that Old Man Willow is already represented here as trying to have do to Tom Bombadil as Old Man Willow did with Merry and Pippin.
So, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil is pretty straightforward. It's Tom Bombadil. He is he's on the river and he runs into trouble with one of the daughters of the river, Goldberry, but manages to sing his way out of it. And then he goes to take a nap against Old Man Willow, and again, he tells Old Man to let him out and drink from the river, and he's suddenly let out. He again gets captured by a family of badgers and tells them, like, let me go. And they're like, oh, sorry about that. Here you go. And finally, there's a barrow right, which in The Lord of the Rings is actually quite terrifying.
Right.
And Tom Bombadil's just like, bye. And manages to get away from all of these sticky situations just by singing, which is something we were talking about earlier. And at the very end, he talks about going back to finding Goldberry that he was infatuated with, saying, like, you'll find no lovers in the water, come with me. And they get married surrounded by flowers. And it's a cute little small poem that just talks about Tom Bombadil, really gives you an idea about what his character is, really borrows a lot from the themes that we see in Lord of the Rings, and is really fun. So with that verbal digest right there, we can talk about it.
Yeah. So I also want to go back to a little pre-writing these books.
Okay.
So in some of his original notes, the feather in Tom Bombadil's hat was originally a peacock feather.
Okay.
But within this poem, we see that it becomes a swan wing feather.
Okay.
Okay.
Do we know what feather was originally in Tom Bombadil's hat, the toy?
No, I don't.
Okay. It would be interesting to find that out.
It's interesting because there are theological scholars that think about Tom Bombadil as well, especially the colors that he has on. The blue hat, the blue jacket. Now, if we go back further than like 200-300 years ago, blue is a very hard color to create and a very expensive color.
Okay.
Matter of fact, that's why the statues of Mary all have blue veils on, to honor, they honor her by using the most expensive pigments.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then the yellow boots themselves are an embodiment of the flowers of the land.
Okay.
And then I read another scholar who talks about the yellow boots helps him hide in the forest because people would assume it's just yellow flowers.
Okay.
And there's all kinds of other theories, but that's as far down the rabbit hole I'm going to go for this episode.
Well, because there is the theory that he is the personification of this wilderness. And not the wilderness that we think of it in modern terms, but this wild nature of Tolkien's time where it is this beautiful, wild thing, just full of wildflowers and trees and grass and overgrown meadows that does have a beauty to it in its own way.
Yeah, and the other thing I like about Tom Bombadil is he is written off so easily. I mean, he's not covered in any of the movie adaptations, not covered in the animation movie, and he's kind of a throwaway. But he's the embodiment of what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
There's even theories that Tom knows what happened to the Entwives.
Oh, okay.
Since he knows everything about the environment, he should know what happened to them.
So we need to get him and Treebeard together to talk.
Right, and then
give him a few days.
And then there are people that take it just a little farther and say that Tom called them to him for some reason.
Interesting.
Yeah, because since he has that, connection with nature and the forest, the old forest.
I'd be curious to read more into that. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, and and that comes from being able to command Old Man Willow.
Okay. I know that when I was doing my reading, I'm not the one making the connection, so don't get mad at me, folks. But someone said that Tom Bombadil was essentially the Stan Lee of the Lord of the Rings universe in the way that he's kind of this omnipotent person that's kind of like knows everything. Oh, you're actually thinking about this. I
Uh,
thought you were going to give me a dirty look.
no, but now that you mention
But
it,
yeah, there was an article I found that was saying that he's kind of like Stan Lee, where he has like these cameos where he's much more intertwined in this story than people would give him credit for, and there's so many theories about him that no one can agree as to what those theories actually are. And I don't, again, I'm very torn about that. Personally, I don't know whether or not I like that description, but I thought it was an interesting take for
well,
sure.
I mean, granted, I'm just hearing this from you now, but as you're talking, I'm thinking because there's the theory that Stan Lee is the Watcher,
Right.
and so that's a perfect job description for Tom Bombadil. I shouldn't say perfect, but it's a good job description.
Yeah.
He's there. He knows what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And he's staying hands off.
Yeah.
Other than threatening all these creatures.
So I don't really see it as threatening them. It's more like he has mastery over them. I don't know. It doesn't sound quite threatening to me.
Well, in the first poem, it doesn't. When we get into the second poem,
We'll talk about the second poem because I read a couple interpretations that I like a little bit better. But anyway, so yeah, he has this mastery over these sticky situations and people listen to him. And something that I found interesting throughout all of it is he tells them to go to sleep and they go to sleep.
right. The other thing that's interesting is that in the first poem, Tom Bombadil's Adventure, everyone that he has contact with before he goes and takes Goldberry for his wife. I just find that's very interesting. You know, that's still very 1920s, 1930s thinking when Tolkien wrote it. You know,
Yeah.
take the woman, take the woman for your bride. But all those people, or all those creatures that he dealt with, are there for the wedding.
Yeah.
Even Old Man Widow was knocking on the window.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, to say the least.
And when it comes to Goldberry, you definitely get the sense that Tom Bombadil, he knows exactly how important he is. Because when he tells her, he's like, come with me, you're not gonna find anyone better, really. It's like, I'm the best here. Hi.
Here we see TV shows about that all the time.
Right. I don't take it from like the modern sense of the Grey's Anatomy is just like, I'm the one for you kind of whatever that always happens on those type of shows. But more of the like, no, we would be good together. Let's try this kind of thing.
Okay.
It's still not great. It's still not a great take. But
Right.
it's not as bad as like the modern like I can't help but just make another Grey's Anatomy thing where like where Meredith goes up to Derek. It's like I choose you, so choose me, kind of thing. It's not that dramatic.
It's not? Okay. I have no idea what Grey's Anatomy is. I don't ever care to know. Write your letters to Evelyn Lewis.
I am a recovering Grey's Anatomy addict.
But the whole theme about this is that Tom does not heed these other voices.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, one last thing. So he takes the blue feather. Anything else?
No, I think that's all we had. Like I said, that first story was pretty just pretty straightforward. Pretty introductory to him. Where I find that this first poem really just introduces us to the character, while the second poem we're about to talk about, Tom Bombadil Goes Boating, is supposed to be set after he meets with the four hobbits. So this next one that we're going into.
But see, that's not what my research has.
Really? Because my research has it that, or the sources that I was seeing were stating that it was supposed to be set after he met them.
No, because this is where scholars get the idea that Tom Bombadil is given the name by the hobbits because he's visited the hobbits before.
Right.
No, long before.
Well, yes, he's been visiting them long before, but the way that I was interpreting this and the way that the research that I was showing was interpreting it was he was visiting again. Like, this isn't his first time visiting. He's saying it's just like, oh, I haven't seen Farmer Maggot in a while. I'm going to go say hi. Is kind of the way that I thought about it.
Okay. I guess that works too.
So the second poem, like we were saying, is Tom Bombadil Goes Boating. Do you want to give a quick summary?
Well, Tom Bombadil goes boating. He makes a boat. He carves some oars, and he decides to go boating. And on this boating is where we see even stronger threats to beings who are trying to stop him from going, from continuing his trip.
Do we?
Yeah.
I don't see them as stronger threats.
No, I don't mean they're stronger. I'm not talking about them being a stronger person or thing threatening. It's just the threats are much more threatening.
Okay, so this is what I wanted to get into. So go ahead and finish the summary, and then we'll get into that.
So Tom Bombadil, every time he runs into somebody, they're like, ha ha ha, I'm going to do so-and-so to you, or I've caught you. And he's like, no, you haven't. I'm going on my way. Oh, okay, go ahead. Go on your way.
Well, see...
But I mean, they don't just want to capture him. There's something they want to do mischievous.
Well, it's mischievous, and it ends with like both of them laughing at the end, and so that's why I take it, and the sources that I was looking at were taking it, where it was a fun, like, insult competition kind of thing, where it's just like throwing insults at each other like friends do, like guys do, where it's just like, hey, whatever. We are a PG podcast, but you know what I mean. But it comes off more like kind of a friendlier kind of way of doing it, which
I don't know.
Which, looking at it, is something that in Anglo-Saxon and Norse writings is something that is very prevalent in those writings that we know that he would know.
But I think it goes beyond those. I mean, even the first one, the Kingfisher. Mm-hmm. The Kingfisher, he says, he's basically telling him, go away or I'll skin you alive and burn you and roast you and eat you. That is not what bros say to each other.
I don't know. I've heard some bros say some weird stuff to each other.
Yeah. So, he continues to the Brandywine. And this is where he goes to Hayes Inn and to Buckland to visit the little folk he knows there.
Exactly, the little folks he knows there, which we were talking about earlier. That's why I interpret it as he's visiting yet again, not for the first time.
Right. Yeah, to me, it's a first read through seems confusing.
Yes, I had to read this about 3 times.
Especially if you enter it with the knowledge that the hobbits are the ones that gave his name that stuck, even though he has a completely different name, but from the elves.
Right.
Even though he has a completely different name from the elves, which basically means elder or eldest son type of thing.
Where Tom Bombadil is just a proper fun name.
Yes.
Doesn't really have a meaning.
And if you think about it, it is very hobbitish.
It is very hobbitish.
I mean, Samwise Gamgee, Frodo Baggins of Baggin. Everybody's got some similarity of a oddball thrown into their name.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, really, before the books were written, did you know anybody that was named? Yeah, I'm asking you like you lived back then.
I was like, what? Yes, I knew several people by the name Samwise back in 1928 when I was just a tot. I went to kindergarten with several.
Okay.
I know where you're going. I know where you're going. I just had to tease you about it. Just like there's little girls out there named Hermione and Khaleesi. Like, I get it.
So he's in his boat. I'm just going to pretend that didn't happen. We're going in his boat, and so the first thing that is kind of threatening him is this bird, a kingfisher. And this bird, they kind of, they threaten each other, but with the big threat from Tom,
Yeah.
I'll catch you and burn you and take your feathers and da-di-da-di-da and eat you.
But they both laugh it off. But I guess it's more of a ha, too far, man, kind of thing, maybe.
Yes, exactly. But here, it's implied, and I think it's heavily implied, but there's nothing that sets it down in concrete. Bombadil ends up with one of the kingfisher's blue feathers, and he puts that blue feather in his hat. Now, from then on, it's called the blue hat. So how I and several others read it is that the hat absorbed that color of blue from the feather. And then that's why the feather looked ratty and needed to be replaced with a swan wing feather.
You mean the other way around?
No, I don't. He gets a swan wing feather later.
No, he replaces the old swan wing feather with the blue one. Pinky bet. We're going to pause here, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, the bird leaves a tome blue feather, which he puts into his hat, replacing an old swan feather.
An old swan feather.
Yeah, an old swan feather. There's no other swan.
Yes,
there's not another.
All right, okay. So we have a disagreement. We're not going to talk about it.
So we have a disagreement whether or not there's another swan. And so if you guys could help us settle the debate, we know for a fact that he replaced the old swan feather in his cap with the blue wren feather, but Dad here says that a swan went by and he did it again. However, I don't see that in the text at all.
Do you? Okay. I'm researching again. Because I said we weren't going to talk about it, and then she talked about it. So.
I was explaining.
Oh, yeah. And then we got the hobbits who shoot his hat. Little bird sat on a twig.
Yeah, so it was a little bird first, and then that was the willow wren, and then it was the kingfisher, and no freaking swan.
This is the kingfisher.
Yeah. The old feather casting.
The old feather casting. It doesn't say it's a sweat. It doesn't say it's a swan feather.
But Tom Goes Boating is set after Adventures of Tom Bombadil, so...
Not really.
Yes, it is. It's set after Adventures of Tom Bombadil, because it's after he's married to Goldberry. And in the Adventures of Tom Bombadil... Yes!
O swan of ever isle sailed past him proudly. Gave Tom a black look, snorted at him loudly. Give me a new one that... Okay.
Ha!
We're still not talking about it.
Because he just lost. So we went back to the text, and yes, we were both kind of wrong and both kind of right, but I was more ultimately right, so that's the important part.
You were more wrong.
I was more right, because while... we proved that not only was the feather cast off an old swan feather...
Do you realize this is our first on-air argument in 2 years, and it's about a stupid friggin' feather.
You're just mad because you got it wrong.
No.
Okay, yes, there was another swan. I was wrong. You were correct. There was another swan in the story. However, he replaces the old feather with a swan feather. It was a swan feather, an old swan feather, and then he replaces it with the blue feather, and then he keeps the blue feather. He doesn't get another swan feather.
No,
he doesn't. No, he doesn't.
Yes. So he takes the blue feather and then he runs into the swan. And the swan...
No, he asked the swan, do you miss your feather? Like, kind of cheekily.
And says, give me a new one.
But he doesn't, though.
Yes, he does.
No, he doesn't.
Give me a new one. The old was worn by weather. Could you speak a fair word? I would love you, dear. Long neck and dumb throat, but still a haughty sneer. If one day the king returns, and upping he may take you, brand your yellow beard, and less loudly make you. O swan huffed his wings, hissed and paddled faster. In his wake, bobbing on Tom, went rolling after.
But he never gave him another feather. That doesn't say anything about giving him another feather. He says, when the king returns. So it's like when Aragorn returns. Like the king that was like promised.
We have to,
Okay, so that's settled.
Right. So if it sounds like I lost the argument, it's because Evelyn does the editing.
I will keep that part in because you're a sore loser, and I want everyone to know that.
Emma Lewis, we're all sore losers. That's why you argued so vehemently.
No, because I was right. Anyway.
So if one day the king returns, that's just weirdly thrown in there for me, but it actually means something decades later for him.
Yeah. Like this one would actually be around. But that's kind of like the whole thing where it's just like no one really knows if the king will return. So it's just like, yeah, whenever the king returns, when pigs fly.
But we have to remember also that this was published before he even seriously started writing The Hobbit, much less The Lord of the Rings.
No. Tom Bombadil Went Boating was actually written for The Adventures of Tom Bombadil in 1962 after Lord of the Rings. What? Pew, 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 pew.
If you don't stop, I'm going to hit delete.
Okay. But yes, that was something that I found really interesting. Is that like
Right,
it does come from earlier sources. He did write Tom Went Boating differently.
I am going to embody my inner dwarf and just harump at you.
But no, you are kind of right. Tom Bombadil Went Boating, because again, this poem. You are kind of right, though, because this poem gave me so much trouble reading it that I did do a lot of research on it, and he wrote something really similar.
I read this thing 3 times, and I still got that. What was stuck in my head wouldn't leave, even after I read it 3 times.
But yeah, like, again, because it was so challenging, like, I was reading it, and apparently he wrote a similar kind of story pre-Hobbit, and he reworked it.
It's actually in the notes. I don't know why they call them notes, but if what he wrote in his letters had a draft letter that had different information in it, it's in that book, Tolkien's Letters, as well, but further on.
Okay.
And here, for these 2 poems, there's several things in there about previous versions. So maybe that's what I'm getting confused with too.
Yeah, because you've read too much and because I haven't read at all, I'm getting this from a kind of a fresher kind of mindset.
So I like the idea that he knows the hobbits. He visits the hobbits. He even knows Farmer Maggot very well. He mentions the sun going over setting over the Shire.
Mm-hmm.
And others talk about his boat as he goes on.
Right.
As he sails off into the sunset.
Without his boat.
and his wife. So,
But no, he just mysteriously leaves early that morning with his boat still there, and finally the animals that he had originally like insulted came and grabbed the boat for him, but they forgot the oars. And so the oars just stayed there.
so the horse just stayed there, which the swan calls wooden feet.
Yeah.
But I mean, you have to remember he's looking through Swan's eyes,
Yeah.
or she's looking through Swan's eyes. You know, they look like
wooden feet.
wooden feet.
Yeah.
I use my feet to get around. Those things are big and have a big flat part on them, and they're flat feet.
Yep.
But I like the fact that he deals with Farmer Maggot, later on, towards the end.
Yeah, and they all have like a big party, and it's a lot of fun.
Oh, one thing I forgot to mention though. When, as doing his trip, he runs into the little folk and they threaten him and they shoot 3 arrows into his hat.
Playfully. Which, again, I would like to bring into the fact that this sounds more like a problem with Tolkien's personality than Tom Bombadil's personality. If this is how Tolkien thinks that people, like rag on each other and, like, play around with each other, like, how is he with his
Well, I mean, you're right. It's kind of, it does go back to old storytelling, which that's what he researched. And, and we didn't have politically correct back then.
Right.
Because otherwise, we wouldn't have Tolkien reaching into the water and basically stealing his wife away from her mother.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, I've been Robert.
Are we done? Was there anything else you wanted to add?
No.
Okay, so I've been Evelyn.
And this is Tolkien about it. Oh,